Could God be all evil instead of all good? This question is at the heart of the Evil God Challenge for theists. And in this video, we're going to answer that challenge in a new way. My guest is Dr. Justin Mooney. So first, what is the Evil God Challenge?
Okay, yeah. So the Evil God Challenge is a challenge to this view that a lot of people have, that there is a God that is all-powerful and all-knowing and all-good. A lot of people think that there's a God like that. And a lot of people think that there are good reasons to believe that there's a God like that. The Evil God Challenge is a challenge to both of those beliefs because it comes in a couple of different forms, right? One version of the Evil God Challenge says this: look, what if there were a God that's all-powerful, all-knowing, and like maximally evil instead of good, right? And the one version of the challenge says we have no better reason to think that there's an all-powerful, all-knowing good God than we have to think that there's an all-powerful, all-knowing, and evil God. And that's because when you look at like the traditional arguments for the existence of God, a lot of them leave open, like, was God good or evil? They don't really settle that. They get you to something like a God that created the universe, right? But maybe it's an evil God, maybe it's a good God, right? So one version of the challenge just says, look, there's no better reason to think that God is good than to think that God is evil, right? And then there's another version of the challenge that kind of takes things a step further and says, actually, we have good reason to think that there is no evil God. And this is from something that's called the problem of good. The idea is that, look, facts about the good in the world, like how much of it there is, for example, are really good reason to think, nope, there actually is no evil God. But then the claim is that exactly the same thing is true, rather a parallel claim is true, for the good God, right? So the thought is the case against good God is equally strong. And so if we shouldn't think that there's an evil, from the problem of evil, I should add, right? So if because of the problem of good, we shouldn't think that evil God exists, then because of the problem of evil, we shouldn't think that a good God exists. Yeah, God exists. Yeah, right. And so there's a couple different versions then of the problem, but both of them, and this will be really important, both of them depend on this claim that the evidence for good God and the evidence for evil God are roughly equally strong or equally weak, however you want to look at it.
Yes. Now, what's new about the solution that you're offering is you're taking solutions to a different sort of problem and applying them to this.
Yeah.
This other problem is called the gap problem.
Yeah.
So what is the gap problem?
Good. And let me just quickly insert in here that we're talking about a paper that I co-authored with Perry Hendricks. So I'm speaking for both of us right now. And Perry knows the evil God side of the literature better than I do, so I may have just butchered that. But anyway, but yeah, the gap problem is the part that I know better. But yeah, so the gap problem is a problem that lots of traditional arguments for God face, okay? And it has to do with the fact that a lot of the usual arguments for the existence of God end up concluding that there is a being with at least one or two of the traditional divine attributes. But then they run into this gap. How do we get from one or two of the traditional divine attributes to all of the traditional divine attributes, or at least like enough of them for us to be able to say, yeah, that thing is God, right? So for example, cosmological arguments tend to try to show that there's like a necessary being that created the universe, or an eternal being, or a first cause of the universe, right? But then the question is, why think that thing, even if it exists, is all-powerful and all-knowing and all-good? And similar questions arise when it comes to like fine-tuning arguments, for example, right? So that's the gap problem. How do you bridge the gap from one or two of the divine attributes to all of the divine attributes? Does that kind of make sense?
Yes. Now, let me just say this. If you're enjoying this video right now, click the like button and help share it with others. Okay, now, you've given us the Evil God Challenge. You've given us the gap problem.
Yeah.
You think that the solutions to the gap problem will also solve the Evil God Challenge as well.
Yeah, so like right now, there are people working on the Evil God Challenge and proposing various responses to it. And then there are also people working on the gap problem and proposing various responses to it. But this seems to be happening separately. And so what Perry and I want to say is, wait a second, look at all these different solutions to the gap problem that people are talking about. Those, if they work, and that is a big if, will also be successful responses to the Evil God Challenge. So, yeah, so that's the main move we're making.
So in the paper, you give 3 of those solutions to the gap challenge. So with the remainder of this interview, we're going to go through those 3 solutions one at a time and see how it applies. Okay. To the evil God challenge.
Yes, to the evil God.
To the evil God challenge. Okay. So the first solution to the gap problem comes from Richard Swinburne.
That's right. So Swinburne has a way of dealing with the gap problem that rests on this controversial, but still like fairly widely. It's not like a weird view. He has this view that simplicity is evidence of truth. So that a hypothesis, to the extent that it's simpler, is more likely to be true. And so what he then does is he argues that theism, the view that there is a God that's all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good, is simpler than rival hypotheses that tend to fall within that gap region. And so, for example, he argues that it's simpler to think that there's just one fundamental cause of the universe than many, and so that rules out at least relevant kinds of polytheism. He also argues that it's simpler to say that one cause of the universe is all-powerful and all-knowing instead of having like finite amounts of knowledge and power. But instead of going into how he argues for those claims, I'm going to focus on the part that will be most relevant for us. And that is Swinburne thinks it's simpler to suppose that an omniscient and omnipotent being is also perfectly good than to say that an omniscient and omnipotent being is not perfectly good. Here's how he does that. He says, look, if you're omniscient, then you will always know in every situation what is the best action to perform in that situation. And if you are omnipotent, then you will always be able to perform the best action in any situation. And then he says this, he says, look, if you are able to perform the best action and you know what that action is, then you will perform that action unless you are subject to the influence of non-rational forces like non-rational desires. And then Swinburne wants to say, look, it's simpler to suppose that an omniscient, omnipotent being isn't subject to any of those forces, doesn't have non-rational desires. Because if you say that being has those things, that makes it a more complicated being. You're adding another kind of entity to its like mind and so forth, right? And so Swinburne then wants to say, look, all right, then it's simpler to suppose that this omniscient and omnipotent being would just always do the best thing, because there's nothing pulling it in any other direction except for the reasons to do what's best, right? And if that being always does the best thing in every situation, then it's morally perfect. So Swinburne then concludes that it's simpler to say that omniscient, omnipotent being is morally perfect rather than that it's... Does that make sense?
Yeah, so Swinburne wants to say omnipotence and omniscience entail moral perfection.
Yeah, if you take them together with a claim about certain other premises, yeah. They don't, not by themselves, but yeah.
Not by themselves. I guess it's this motivation. You
need a kind of view about motivation where like in the absence of any like desires
factors,
pulling in that you will do what reason favors.
Yes.
And you also need a premise about simplicity. Like it's simpler to say that God doesn't have any like non-rational desires or something.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So now apply that to the evil God challenge.
Yeah. Okay. So the application to the evil God challenge is really quite straightforward, right? Because the thought here is like, all right, suppose Swinburne is right, that it's simpler to say that an omniscient being is perfectly good rather than not. Then theism, the view that there's a being like that, is a simpler hypothesis than maltheism, which is the name for the view that there's an evil God, omnipotent, omniscient, but evil, right? And if simpler hypotheses are more likely to be true, other things being equal, then it turns out theism is more likely to be true than maltheism, other things being equal. And it's part of the case that the evil God challenge makes, that they are like equal in other respects. So actually it will turn out that theism is more likely true than maltheism, if Swinburne is right.
So with that evil God challenge, what's supposed to make it more rational to believe in good God than evil God? That's one of the driving questions.
Yeah.
And Swinburne's answer would be,
It's
good
simple.
God is simpler than evil.
And therefore more probable. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the other version says, well, they're equally on a par and also like you shouldn't believe in evil God. So therefore, since they're equally, the evidence supporting them is equally weak or strong or whatever, you also shouldn't believe in good God. But notice that version 2 depends on this assumption that or maybe I shouldn't say assumption because people argue for this, but it depends on the premise that they're equal in terms of how much evidential support they have. And that they aren't equal if Swinburne is right. At
Right.
any rate, that's what Perry and I want to say.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay, so now let's move to the second type of solution to the gap problem. That was Swinburne's solution to the gap problem, and then you applied it to the evil God challenge. Now we're going to look at Dr. Josh Rasmussen's solution to the gap problem. What is it?
Rasmussen has a really interesting solution to the gap problem, and I'm going to give you a version of it that kind of pieces together a couple different presentations he's made of the problem, and I think it's pretty faithful to his view, but I'm trying to just make the best version of it that I can in a way. But roughly, what Rasmussen said is something like this. He says, look, he defends a contingency argument that concludes that there's a necessary being on which all contingent things in the universe depend, right? And then he wants to say, okay, I think that this necessary being has the other divine attributes. And his answer to this is he ends up arguing that the necessary being is also an unlimited being. Okay, so for Rasmussen, limits are like finite values of degreed properties. So finite amounts of height and weight and mass and shape and so on. Those are all limits. All right. And Rasmussen defends what I take to be a kind of principle of sufficient reason or something in like the principle of sufficient reason family, which claims that all limits have explanations. And I think, though he's not always as clear about this as I would like, that he's thinking of specifically of causal explanations. So anytime there's a limit, there's some causal explanation of that limit. There's some cause why the thing has exactly that height or that weight or that size. Okay, now he defends this principle. I'm not going to go into how he defends it, but here's how he employs it in this case. He says, look, suppose that all limits have causal explanations, right? Then if you've got this necessary being that sort of like causal produces everything else, right? That thing can't have any limits, at least not in its most causally fundamental state. Because if it did, those limits would have no causal explanation. The only way they could have a causal explanation is if either they were like explaining themselves or there was like an explanatory loop where one of the things that God makes comes around and like explains God's limit, the necessary being. I guess I shouldn't rush to God yet, right? But anyway, so Rasmussen argues, look, if all limits have causal explanations, then the necessary being fundamentally has, at its most causally fundamental state, has no limits, right? Mm-hmm. And then from here, he can derive the rest of the divine attributes. And this is one way he does it. He says, look, the necessary being that created the universe has at least some causal power because it created the universe, right? But it can't have a limited amount of causal power because that would be a limit, an unexplained limit, ultimately. So it must have unlimited causal power, right? And then he says, if it has unlimited causal power, right, that's omnipotence, one of the divine perfections, right? Mm-hmm. So it seems like a being like that would have at least some value, but it can't have a limited amount of value because that would be a limit that's unexplained, right? And so he says, then it must have an unlimited amount of value. And if a being that has an unlimited amount of value is either going to be a perfect being or at least a maximally great being. And then from there, it looks like you can derive the rest of the divine attributes. Once you've got a perfect being, you can say, okay, a perfect being would be a being that's all-powerful and all-knowing, and more importantly for our purposes, perfectly good, right? Okay, so that's in outline Rasmussen's move.
That's his solution to the gap problem. It's probably pretty straightforward to the viewer how that applies to the evil God challenge, but just say it explicitly.
Right, so again, both versions of the evil God challenge say that there's the case, overall case for good God is no stronger or weaker, at least approximately, than the overall case for evil God, right? But if Rasmussen's solution to the gap problem is correct, then that isn't true because there's a really good reason to think that there's a good God and not an evil God, namely that this fundamental being that caused the universe has no limits. And we just saw that this limits argument can arguably get us to this thing is good rather than evil, right? Okay, did that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah.
So why should you believe in good God over evil God? It's because the good God has no limits and evil God does have limits.
Yeah.
He's limited in value. And when we're talking about a fundamental causal explanation,
nice.
The fundamental causal explanation looks like if our principle is right, it looks like that fundamental entity has no limits.
Yeah, I really like how you summarized that. Yeah.
Okay. Now, the third solution comes from, I should say, the third solution to the gap problem comes from Ryan Byerly.
Yeah.
What's his solution to the gap problem?
Yeah, okay. So Byerly says, Suppose he's again thinking in the context of a contingency argument, right? So he says, suppose we discover that a necessary being caused the universe, right? Discover that by way of like a good argument for that conclusion. Okay.
Mhm.
Why I think that this necessary being has the other divine attributes as well? Byerly thinks we can get there by way of what's called an abductive inference, right? Where it's not like we know for sure, but it's a kind of inference where it's like, often it takes the form of an inference to the best explanation, right? Okay, let me explain how this works, following Byerly's example by talking about ravens. All right, so right now I live in Alberta, so I see ravens sometimes. And I'm talking legit ravens, right? Not crows, which are like discount ravens, right? But like actual ravens.
Yes.
Now, every raven that I have seen is black. Okay, now, why? Why is it that every time I see a raven, it's a black raven? Okay, Byerly points out that one, like, felicitous explanation would be because all ravens are black. Yeah, that wouldn't be a crazy thing to say if I asked, why is every raven I'm seeing black, right? All ravens are black, right? Okay, so Byerly says, look, it looks like universal generalizations, statements like all A's are B's, right? All ravens are black, seem to be able to explain discoveries or observations of their instances, right? So all ravens are black can explain like why I saw a black raven, or why the raven that I saw was black right over here, and also why that one was black. Anyway, okay. And then he says, well, all right, come back to the gap problem, right? Suppose we've discovered that the cause of the universe is a necessary being. Well, necessary existence is traditionally considered to be one of the divine perfections, one of those attributes that makes God perfect, right? And so we can ask, well, why have we discovered that this cause of the universe has this perfection? And one of the possible explanations would be because it has all perfections, right? Mm-hmm. And then what Byerly does is he argues, not only is that like a candidate explanation, but it's actually the best explanation. All right, so compare it for the view that there's like a God that has maybe only some of the divine perfections, right? Why not think that? Byerly says, you could say like the reason why we've discovered that the cause of the universe has this one perfection, necessary existence, is because it has some perfections, right? Mm-hmm. But that would be like saying the reason all the ravens I've seen are black is because some ravens are black. Yeah, you could say that, but other things being equal, that's a worse explanation than all ravens are black. Similarly, why with the cause of the universe, having some perfections is a worse explanation than it's having all the perfections. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's basically Byerly's move. Did that kind of make sense?
Yeah, that made great sense. Now apply it to the evil God challenge.
Yeah, okay, so the thought here is this. If we accept Byerly's move, then it turns out a being's having some of the divine perfections is abductive evidence that it has all of the divine perfections, right? So if we're considering a being that is all-powerful and all-knowing, right? That's two major divine perfections right there. According to Byerly's view, the fact that it has those properties is abductive evidence that it also has perfect goodness, as well as whatever the other divine perfections are, right? And so it's evidence for the good God hypothesis over the evil God hypothesis.
Yeah.
And in that case, once again, it's contrary to both versions of the evil God hypothesis. It's not true that the two are evidentially on a par. There is a reason to prefer good God over evil God, evidentially, not just like, oh, I'd rather there be a good God, right?
Yeah. The three views that we've talked about are simplicity, limits, and abductive inference.
Yeah.
And those are solutions to the gap problem. But what you do with your co-author, Perry Hendricks, in this new paper that's coming out, you say those solutions work for the evil God challenge.
Yeah.
Now, stick around because there's one important point left. There are solutions to the evil God challenge that won't solve the gap problem, right? You don't get into that in the paper, but I do get into those sorts of solutions with Dr. Max Baker-Heitch. And if you want to watch that video, then click right here.